Just by way of background, the focus of this webinar has been or will be on the work of the Generosity Commission, not so much the work of the Generosity Commission, but more the problems it has identified and the solutions that it's seen, and get the input of three true experts in aspects of American life. The Generosity Commission was formed about 2 years ago in response to by the Giving Institute, and it was in response to trends in giving and volunteering. What we were seeing was that year over year, more money is given in our society by fewer givers, and year over year, more hours are donated, but by fewer volunteers. And the question before us was, what does that mean? What does that mean for the way Americans and others function in our democracy? What does it mean for the health of our communities, the resilience of our communities? And what does it mean for the effectiveness of our democracy? If you have this decline in the number of what we refer to as engaged citizens who happen to express their engagement through volunteering, through giving, through voting, and even mobilizing. So that is the focus of the commission. Its remit was to do three things. The first was to better understand these trends, to gain a greater knowledge of what they represent, to sort of illuminate the role that are played by engaged citizens, and finally to help increase their numbers. Joining us for this conversation is going to be Simranjit Singh. Simran will turn on his video so we can see my colleague. He heads the Religion and Society program at the Aspen Institute. He's the author of the bestseller, The Light We Give, How Sikh Wisdom Can Transform Your Life. He's a fellow for racial equity at Columbia University, and you can find his impressive bio in the chat function. Dominica Lynch heads up the program on Latinos and Society at the Aspen Institute. Its focus is on promoting long-term growth, long-term resilience. She used to work as CEO of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, and as led the Latino Alumni Association of the University of Southern California. So she comes from worlds of policy and practice. And then finally, Bonita Robertson Hardy. She is the co-executive director of the Community Strategies Group at the Aspen Institute. Its focus is primarily on rural populations. She herself is a specialist in economic development. She advocates for equity and opportunity for rural populations. And she explores the way that all three sectors, that's to say businesses, governments, and civil society, how they can work together to achieve a better world for us all. It's basically how we solve problems in America. She too has been focused on concepts of identity, of community, of generosity. So I'm just going to open with Simran and ask you, alongside these trends in giving and volunteering and other forms of civic engagement, there is yet another, and that's a decline in religiosity, or at least as measured by attendance at church, at mosque, at temple. Tell us what that means, given that faith is so much a part of, and these institutions build community. What does that mean for us as a society and for our communities as they function?
Yeah, thank you, Jane. And you're exactly right. There's a big question in our society right now of what it will mean as we see the changing landscape of religion, and rapidly changing. I mean, there's declining church attendance and declining religious affiliation, and a shift in how important people, Americans in particular, see their religious identities. And in some ways, there are counter narratives, like different kinds of spiritualities that people are interested in or committed to. But I do think there's something interesting and important to talk about when it comes to religion and religious traditions in particular. There are many researchers who are exploring the correlations between declining religiosity with other cultural shifts like the mental health crisis or overall happiness, criminality, and much more. And I think one issue we can attend to and consider here is the relationship between faith and giving, and how the shifting landscape of religion in America might contribute to a shift in how people give, how we give. And one reason for this is we know that religion and religious communities continue to be a consistent source of generosity and philanthropy, and that in many traditions, giving is it's built into the structures of these traditions, right? And in the Christian tradition, we would talk about tithe, or in Islam, zakat. In the Jewish tradition, sadaqah. In my own tradition, tasfand. And these are all structured, ritualized, and systematized mechanisms for cultural giving, which means that when the tides shift, right, when the economic context changes, when the political context changes, people who have been disciplined into giving by their own traditions, they still continue to do so. And so the point here is that giving is not conditional because it's habituated. And as the religious landscape changes, and as people become distant from these traditions that systematize giving, I'm wondering, what impact will these changes have on giving and generosity? Will a decline in religious affiliation writ large, a decline in religious commitment across the board, also mean a decline in giving and volunteering? And if so, and if we think giving and volunteering are important, which I think we can agree on, then the question becomes, well, what do we do about that? So that's just a quick reflection on the question, Jane, but thank you for asking it.
I love your reference to cultural generosity, because I think that's such a strong, I mean, it's not just your relationship with your God, but it's your relationship with a whole community of folks who share your values. And so I like that a lot. I actually, you're giving me an opportunity to, well, first, let me just ask you about generational shift. I'm assuming that this decline in religiosity is happening over generations, that grandma and grandpa, do do attend church or mosque or temple, but that young people may have a different way of expressing their relationship to their faith. We tend to, when we look at nonprofit data, we tend to look at giving to or through a faith institution. Are young people giving in that way, or have they found a different way to engage?
Yeah, I think you're putting your finger on something really important, Jane, which is at least my view on it, is that part of the decline in religiosity has to do with a loss of faith and trust in religious institutions, and that can be, everything from the church sex abuse scandal to how religion and religious leaders manipulate their communities for political gain. And we are becoming more and more attentive to that. And younger people especially are disillusioned by religion. And what that means is when there's less trust in religious institutions and organizations, then we are seeing people are less inclined to give through these channels. And in a lot of cases, as you know better than anyone, Jane, these often are the channels for addressing some of the greatest humanitarian crises that we encounter, right? Like Catholic Charities, which has been at the forefront of these, has been largely affected by how people view the church and their loss of trust in the church. And so there is, it seems to me, a really important correlation here to call attention to.
Right, right. And as we look at these trends in giving and volunteering, they are also alongside a dramatic rise in social isolation and decline in societal trust.
That's
So
right.
it's just their faith institutions, they're losing confidence in all institutions. Dominica, you work with various Latinx communities, and I put it in the plural because I think it's not all that homogenous group, but what they have in common is they tend to be Roman Catholics. And what they have in common is a sense of those values that come along with the church, but also a commitment to the community in which they are a part. So talk a little bit about civic engagement slash volunteering giving on the one hand, and a relationship with the church on the other.
Thank you. I want to basically I concur with a lot of what Simran just said. For Latinos, although the majority of us have been sort of Catholic origin for our faith, that's been steadily declining. We're currently about 46% according to the latest Pew. And more of us are more not tethered to a particular faith, about 30% of Latinos now. So I think that part of it is changing our relationship to some of these institutions and in the way that we're giving and showing up. But that said, I think this concept of our cultural generosity, because faith is so tied to our culture, to the way we perceive our collective worldview, that even as we, integrate into or really want to manifest the American dream, it is tied to so much of the faith we put in that journey to come to this country. And when we come to this country, we enter into communities that look like us, that welcome us. And the church tend to be those community navigators. Our first stop communities are the communities that welcome us, that understand our culture, that there's an inherent trust. And so whether it's a Catholic church or another type of evangelical church, it becomes our way of making sense of our new American reality. And it's this connecting sort of the dots moment, right? And I so appreciate being part of the conversation, that through faith, we embark so many challenges. And there's so many sayings culturally. We say, lo que Dios quiera, what God wishes for us. Or no hay mal que por bien no venga. There's no bad that for good it won't come. It really strengthens the community that if you just overcome, because the stories of the Bible show us that those heroes went through tremendous adversity, and the transformation of that through that adversity it really was about love and grace and generosity. And so, the church being that first stop, that sort of intermediary between American culture, really building on our faith that there are better days ahead, that hard work, integration and learning, and many of these churches are economic development corporations. They kind of connect us to resources. They encourage us to start our businesses. So I love this notion of first stop communities. There are organizations like, for example, in Philadelphia, we have Esperanza, that part of their mission statement is about serving those that the lesser ones of us, and I'm getting the scripture wrong, but the idea that if we give to those that have less of us, that we're going to be blessed, and that there's a multiplier effect, and that is part of that cultural generosity that Simran was referring to. So I, even my own experience coming into this country as a 6-year-old little girl, my first remembrance of becoming American was sort of the association with the church and faith. And that if you have faith and you believe in sort of greater power, that you may not know exactly what's ahead of you, but the right people will show up, the right path will be revealed. And I do think that tapping into that, even as we think of why the voting patterns of Latino vary, because the Latino community is not monolithic. It depends on what region of South America Central South America we come from. Also depends on our socioeconomic status. It depends on our ethnic background, whether we're a white Latino, indigenous Latino, a Black Latino, Asian Latino. And the other pieces too, that I think it's really important that, we ultimately there is a trust and confidence. We believe in hard work. And when we plug into community, we're givers, natural givers. And so I think this sort of assault to our character that we're takers of America, it's very personal because it's a lot of our, we do the hardest jobs and we want to give and we give back. And sometimes the way that we give are not accurately recorded. And I think that part of the commission, the report, we'll touch more on that. But the ways that Latinos give, I believe is growing. It's just not being documented correctly. So I'll stop there because I think faith is so much inherent to our culture and the way that we view the world.
Thank you so much. And I'll ask you a question about a sense of obligation, but let me just say that that the first recommendation of the Generosity Commission is that we find a way to gather the kind of data. Let me step back and just say we have enormous access to data on giving to nonprofits, to volunteering for nonprofits. We don't have data on the informal giving, the informal volunteering, the showing up for your neighbor and offering to, to run an errand for them, the support over an appeal that you see in a GoFundMe campaign. These are areas of enormous growth that we don't yet capture. And the good news is that there are several organizations coming together to do just that. And then we'll have a much better picture of generosity.
And if I can plug a report that just came out from Hispanics in Philanthropy, they do a beautiful job of really outlining the diversity within the community, acculturation, and how faith is and culture, they're tied together. So more specificity there, but data collecting is important.
You also capture the younger generation when you look at the different forms of giving, some of which have long histories, but the pandemic brought them to the fore when we didn't have ways of showing up to church or to a nonprofit, and we expressed our generosity in new ways. I also want to just ask you, Dominique, about the norms, the obligations when it comes to giving and volunteering that tend to bind Latinos and society together. The sort of priority.
Yeah, my son once made an observation about how sometimes I give with a sacred sense, like a sacred obligation. Leadership, I see leadership as a sacred obligation. And it occurred to me that culturally, it is about that. It is about, and it comes from our faith that if you're blessed, there'll be more blessings if you share. So through the church, we know that. So when there's a new immigrant that comes in, we help them navigate the world. When I was at USC, the importance of alumni, I could call an alumni and say, I have the student that doesn't have a suit to go to an interview. And they would write the check, they would bring the suit, like if it was their own child. Sort of this sense that they recognize that they needed to step in. The other way, I think even through organizations like ours, when we bring leaders together during the pandemic, the importance of whether they were, the importance of putting community ahead of being personalities and challenges. And so that to me, it's so inspiring. And it is a sacred obligation, if you will. It is how we're brought up. Also larger families. So you have larger families already inherently, you have responsibility for your younger siblings. And younger and young people, and I was one of these, when you come in and you learn English, you are also the intermediary for your parent. You are translating, you are brokering the new culture in America for your parents. So children to parents, there's a lot that the children give, particularly once children get educated and in the ways that they take care of their parents, they're the retirement for their parents. So in that sense, it's very much of the dynamic of having this collective worldview. And then the other piece of it is also the obligation of who we left back at home. And so the importance of sending money back home. And during the pandemic, what brings me to tears is just to know that, as we talked about essential workers and many Latino essential workers, they already had a lot of hardships here. But what we saw, which was incredible, was the amount of generosity and basically sending money back home that sustained and kept people alive in Latin America is just astonishing. The amount of remittances that went to Central and South America, just to illustrate Mexico before the pandemic, about 20 billion annually from US to Mexico. And after the pandemic, it doubled, and even as of last year, 63 billion in terms of money that's sent from the United States to Mexico to support relatives and friends there. So this notion of sacred obligation, I think it fits, because I think we are just committed to the well-being of our communities and our families.
Bonita, I'm going to ask you to help us understand what rural populations in this country look like. Those of us who sit on one coast or the other assume that rural populations are all white, they're all Christian, they're all, that we have a set of assumptions about them. But in fact, they include immigrant populations more and more, but they're also racially diverse. So say a word about how do we picture the world that you help serve?
So thank you, Jane. And I am privileged to be in conversation with you and my fellow Aspen colleagues. I think it's important to understand that it's a great question, because rural is not a monolith, just like Latinx communities are not a monolith. So you have rural communities that can be closer to metro areas, but still rural. And then you can have rural communities that are really considered frontier communities. So vastly, vast space between one community from another. You can be hundreds of miles between communities. They're like underpopulated. There's not a lot of people. They're less populated regions. So rural communities really do span. It's not just one. If you've seen one rural community, you might just know one rural community. They can be very different. But what some of our work that we've been doing most recently with some of the Minnesota Initiative Foundations have really shown is that a state like Minnesota, which is a huge state, but people might think of the urban cores, the cities, but it is a very rural state when you get outside of the cities, and it is not densely populated in some of those rural communities. And there are a lot of immigrant communities. A lot of Somali immigrants have gone to Minnesota. And so thinking about how the Minnesota Initiative Foundations are actually really pushing welcoming and belonging, and what does that actually look like for some of the new Americans that are coming to their communities, but also really grappling with how do you think about welcoming and belonging when you're also surrounded by a number of indigenous communities? And what does that look like? Is it really welcoming and belonging when you're talking about some of your native and indigenous people? Are you welcoming them? And what does that context actually look like? And how do you have those conversations in a really respectful way? And so that's what I would say about, rural communities are not a monolith. They're very different. But what we see is that across the country, a number of intermediaries or hubs or community foundations are really answering the call to think about their communities in a different way and really proactively try to think about their grant making and their how they reach out to their communities as well.
So Bonita, you used to work for the Community Foundation of Greater New Orleans, and one of the best community foundations in the country. I mean, extraordinary model. So I'm going to ask you to just say a word about the areas of emphasis there, because you worked on leadership, you worked on development, et cetera. But then move on to a conversation about community foundations as a means to enable everyday giving, everyday volunteering. Is that an underleveraged resource as we look at this challenge of everyday giving shrinking?
Well, Jane, I have to agree with you and give a big shout out to all of my colleagues from the Greater New Orleans Foundation, because they really, and a number of my mentors, they really taught me about philanthropy and how philanthropy can actually be done differently, and how community foundations can really play an active role in thinking about economic and community development within their regions, not just in a traditional approach of thinking about donor advised funds in and donor advised funds out. And so the foundation, and much like a number of foundations across the country, country are really taking the lead on thinking and being a real partner with the community around economic development. I think that that word is key, a partner. They're not doing it on their own. They're doing it in collaboration with others around them. And so what you saw through the Greater New Orleans Foundation was really thinking about the housing investments across the region, particularly coming after Hurricane Katrina, which was devastating to our region and a lot of regions across the Southeast, obviously. But how do you think about a real housing investment that really can be transformative? Thinking about economic development and opportunities with regards to workforce. Really thinking about the cutting edge pieces of how can you create supports that help people, because getting a job isn't enough in any community. You have to have a lot of the supports around you that help you keep that job, particularly for a lot of our people that are coming, that don't have a lot of means, that are thinking, that are getting into the workforce for the first time, or that are BIPOC, right? And so the foundation really puts a particular emphasis on that, and thinking about the equity piece. New Orleans, the region, is not a wealthy region. And so just like a lot of regions across our country. And so how do you think about equity at the forefront of that work? And so I think that's been critical in how the foundation has really changed and really grown their programmatic areas. And I think what we see is a lot of foundations are actually doing the same thing and really being in partnership with their communities. And one of the things that we do at Aspen Institute Community Strategies Group is really think about them as hubs. So we think about, what are the intermediaries that are doing economic development differently? And that can be a community foundation. That could also be a community action entity. It can come in a number of different ways. It doesn't have one form, but they all have different they all have the same characteristics around. They have the ability to bring people together across divides. They have a convening power, right? They have the ability to take a risk on something. And even if it doesn't work out in the way that it was intended, they can still take that on. And so these intermediaries are really critical and key to thinking about community and economic development in a different way, because they have the ability to bring people together across the divides. They have the ability to take the risk, and they're accountable to the community at the end of the day, which is also critically important. And so I think that really is one of the cutting edge pieces of how community foundations can really take an active role within their regions.
I'm so glad you raised Hurricane Katrina and its aftermath, because that was one of the few examples when everyday giving went way up.
Yeah.
And everyday volunteering went way up. September 11th was similar. Some of the floods and hurricanes and fires. We have these moments after disaster. The pandemic was interesting because an experiment happened with regard to community foundations, and that is that large private foundations that are national and international in their outlook and in their kind of in their grant making, realized that we are not necessarily proximate to the communities in which we operate, where we live, where our headquarters are, and we're not necessarily really knowledgeable about community solutions that are bubbling up on their own. And so they would transfer several $1 million that they would have spent on a local program that they weren't so sure they were qualified to do, instead transfer them to the community foundation. It was an experiment. It's not how we used to do business, but it really worked. And they liked that experiment. So we may see more of that. That'd be wonderful. Finally, I'll just make one comment. And that is that it's hard to understand this beast called community foundation, because they vary a lot from community. They reflect their community, right? But they also, tend to have certain functions. They're really good fundraising from the community. They're really good stewards of your funds once they're raised, and they're good at providing advice on philanthropy. What they're also good at, though, and what their business model doesn't necessarily support, is building community. And in many ways, that's the most important part of their job. So they are thinking through, others are thinking through. We'll love to hear from you, how you build a business model that supports all aspects of your work. Because these are folks who are stretched thin and do wonderful things, important things. Sorry for that advocacy in that moment. So
Jane, I think that's just so important. I mean, I think the proximity to the issues and the wonderful things that are happening within communities, right? They know the best way to invest the money. And I think that is one of the wonderful things that happened out of the devastation of Hurricane Katrina was that there was a huge influx of resources from the national foundations that came to the local foundations that gave the local foundations an ability to really divert resources to where it could go. And so I think that the proximity to the ground is always important when thinking about community and community needs. And so I echo your thoughts completely.
So as before we pivot to questions from our viewers and our audience who've joined us, I want to talk a little bit with each of you about the role of economic development. One of the things, one of the reasons that there's been a decline in everyday giving is that there's been a shrinking of the middle class. The very folks who are keeping community organizations, people serving organizations alive, either by providing their own volunteer work or giving $50, $100. I'm not talking about big foundations. I'm talking about us folks. So Benita, because you are the expert on economic development, actually all three of you have expertise there, but you're the big one. I'm going to ask you about the role of, first of all, when you look at rural populations, they are not the ones that necessarily benefited from economic globalization. Well, although others might be. And while wealth was created, it doesn't tend to it resides in the hands of a few. And whereas businesses were created, they weren't the family farm. They weren't mining, they weren't the sort of set of traditional professions and industries. Those are shrinking rather than growing. And what does that mean? And I'm going to take it, but I'm going to start with you, Benita.
Yeah, so I think one thing that we try to keep in mind in our work at CSG is really thinking about the asset-based approach to development across the regions that we work with in our rural communities and rural regions, right? And so, one of the things that we think about is this WealthWorks approach, really thinking about what is already happening within a community. Is there a way to build a value chain around what's already working in a community? And there are WealthWorks sites across the country that are implementing this and implementing it well, right? One of the things that we do understand and through our work in communities is that, for farming, for instance, agriculture, it has changed. It has just drastically changed. And so what we were talking to some of our folks in Minnesota, and they were saying, the family farm, the farmer that used to be his primary job, what we are finding is that is no longer the primary job. There may be another job that the family farmer has just because the sector has changed completely. But regardless, what we say is that you have to think about the assets that are already within the community and build from there. Because what we know is that for our rural communities and rural regions, you can't bet at all on thinking that Amazon is coming to your region, because that cannot be good for a number of reasons, but everybody can't have an Amazon. For instance, I use that as an example, right? And so, not just thinking about what is this one company that's going to come in and save us or fix all of our problems, because that's just not realistic. And with a big company comes a lot of other things, right, that you have to account for. Thinking about transportation, thinking about childcare, thinking about your education system. And in a lot of communities that we're talking about, particularly when you're talking about rural communities where your transit is you're driving from place to place, what does that mean for your infrastructure? And so how do you think about the assets within a community and build something around those existing assets versus thinking about this attraction approach?
Yeah. Simran, you've been all about equity in sort of building equitable systems in all your work. I mean, if you look back at your many accomplishments, the goal of equity keeps coming through. I know that stems from your faith, but it goes beyond your face. So say something about the importance of equity in building social cohesion, in basically helping us all.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing to be in this position in this conversation, because I don't typically talk about these things from my own faith perspective, and I also don't typically talk about these issues from other people's faith perspectives. Like theology is something that I personally care about, but it doesn't always figure in to the work that I do. And I'll say in this conversation, it feels pertinent, especially because so many of the values that we espouse as a democracy intersect with some of the core values that our faiths offer us. And the particular one that you're lifting up, Jane, around equity, is this deep belief that we are all, in some vocabulary or another, we're all formed in the image of God. And to me, that is something that I find resonant across traditions, including secular ones, where when we're looking at issues like racial hierarchy or poverty or the wealth gap, it rankles me, and it says to me that we are so far from who we say we want to be, and that dissonance between our behaviors and our aspirations is just so, I mean, frustrating is a word, and I understand it, right? Like, I'm a human being too, and I have my own hypocrisies and inner tensions and ways in which I'm not the person I want to be. But to look at it at a systemic level, in the way that we are in this conversation, and to say, like, we know what the right thing to do is, and people know, and the people who are giving and trying, we all know, but that for a whole host of reasons, including structures that have been handed down to us that we are now interrogating, it's very difficult sometimes to look at our reality and say, oh, we're not actually doing or living in the way that we want to be. So that to me is actually a very coming from deeper within me in terms of why this conversation feels so necessary.
So we have a question from the audience, and let me start out with one of them. And it asks, this questioner asks, how do you work with the spectrum of groups without seeming to tokenize or dishonor their belief systems? Who wants to raise their hand on that? It's a really powerful question. I mean, I think we often, we think we're serving, we think we're lifting others. But in fact, we take our own selves and our own biases to everything. How do you avoid the sort of, at least appearance or even reality, but I think more appearance of tokenism?
So I'll start, and I know my colleagues have their own thoughts about this. From the CSG, Community Strategies Group side, one of the things that we always start with when we go into community is that unless it's one of the communities that we're actually from or have lived in, we say we're not from your community. And so we are here to share with you what we have learned through our experience working with communities that may be similarly situated, but you are the folks that live here, and you know your community, you have the ties, you have the trust here. We're trying to build that trust. And so I think acknowledging that first and foremost when you're working with community is critically important. I'll also use an example from one of the communities that we're working with, and I think it's the Northland Foundation. They are actually doing some work around individual giving to Indigenous communities. And I think the term is Matauking. I hope I'm not butchering it too much, but really thinking about how do you give to Indigenous communities who are bringing folks together to really be in community together. And they realized that their normal grant cycle wasn't getting the resources to the people that were on the ground actually doing the community building. And so they retrofitted or they actually built a program that would do that, and really taking the approach of we're going to lead by giving the money to the people that need it most. And that required an individual grant making program. And individual grant making for a foundation can be difficult, and it's not without its challenges. But I think that is really being in touch with the community, and an example of how you can do that in a way that is respectful, and not tokenizing their indigenous communities, but actually saying, what can we do to help? Here is a resource that we can provide, and stepping back.
So we have another wonderful question. I really like this one, and that is to ask panelists to provide examples in which local communities have partnered across geography around a specific great big goal. If it's climate change mitigation, for example, if it's to advance racial equity, whatever that big, hairy problem is, what are the examples of collaboration across sectors that are not just fueled by very large institutions? I mean, I'm thinking of Strive. I'm thinking, there's several examples, but you'll have more current examples to provide. Dominique,
I'll share. So some of our work at Latinos in Society during the pandemic was really to help leaders organize themselves around particular strategies to make sure that their businesses, small businesses, Latino, Black businesses remained open and could grow and prosper after the pandemic. There was so much federal aid going, but it was bypassing certain communities just due to lack of capacity. So we saw cross-sector leaders, public, private, foundations, business owners, setting up committees, and then being very intent on implementing those strategies, not staying in the sort of talking over the problem, but really looking at solutions. An organization that is doing a wonderful job is the Latino Community Foundation. It's based in San Francisco. Their new CEO is former HUD Secretary Julian Castro. And what's exciting about the Latino Community Foundation and his predecessor, Jacqueline Garcelle, just incredible leader. Under her vision, they started giving circles. And so sort of the mantra of, for Latinos by Latinos, and bringing together regional communities, thinking through, was it Latina businesses? Was it tech startup? Was it climate change and climate solutions, education? And then as a group, pulling their money and being able to make that call as a group via Zoom to let, whatever organization or business say, you're receiving $15,000 from us, and so that powerful moment of, it's a feel good moment, right? Because they could see that their $1,000 pulled with, somebody else's, $500 and $5,000 could generate impact. And so they've given collectively now about 2.6 million. And I know that under Julian Castro, this foundation, the Latino Community Foundation, is going to go national. So I'm excited to see what they do. But we saw many examples of that. So I am more optimistic than ever. I do think we are the survivors of the pandemic. It really challenged us all. And I hold on to the belief that maybe we're not counting the ways, but we have diversified our time and our money and the way even that we connect to God and giving. So economic development is important because it feeds people, it keeps them safe. And ultimately, at the very core of what we experienced in the pandemic was we needed a shelter in place and feel safe. And somehow that still stayed with us. So there's many organizations out there like that.
We see multiple different communities, different cities and towns, and even rural areas that are moved by the problem of the unhoused. And you feel this, your mention of San Francisco, Dominique, just reminds me that in California, it's a very acute problem, the sort of growing need to do something about it, but it also requires all three sectors. So it's a great example of that. And what's interesting that's happening is that these different, completely distinct efforts are starting to connect the dots among them. and to learn from each other. Simran, you were nodding, so I want to make sure I called on you, or were you just nodding?
Oh, I was just nodding, but just to pick up on a point that you were raising here, Jane, on you were talking about the unhoused, and that raised for me some efforts that I'm seeing connecting the dots on incarceration and mass incarceration. And there's some, I live in New York City, and there's Trinity Wall Street Church is, both a philanthropy and a church, and they're leading an effort to close down Rikers prison system, and that to me has been a shining example of what it can look like to bring these three sectors together for social change in a particular locality, but then also as a model for what that could look like elsewhere. So it's just something that came out of what you were saying, Jane. So thank you.
Yeah.
Can I also just say something really quickly, Jane, about because I think it connects to what Simran's saying and to what Dominica said, and I think we touched on it a little bit. A lot of younger people are also thinking about their giving around giving circles. And that is really cool and exciting. And whether it's from, emerging philanthropists of New Orleans, which I was a part of years and years ago, or Go Girl Giving, it is really exciting to see young people really galvanizing around core issues that are important to them, whether it's reforming the prison industrial complex, or whether it is thinking about the unhoused, or entrepreneurial opportunities, seeding entrepreneurship among Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Like, they are really thinking about their giving in a way that it doesn't have to be with a formal institution that may have been the way that people gave before, but thinking about it in a different way, whether that's crowdfunding or just giving circles, or how are they pooling resources, or even friends coming together to say, okay, we're going to give our time and our treasure and our money to this organization at this time. And it's not anything formal, but it's a collective, a group of people. And I think young people are really taking that by the helm and doing it a little bit differently.
Yeah. And these include folks who you would think just don't have the means, right? I mean, I know a young woman who sleeps on someone else's couch, and she is, because she can't afford rent, she is part of organizing a giving circle with friends that are giving
Exactly
$50 here, $100 there. But that generosity is resident.
Yep.
The other thing I think to bear in mind in all of these conversations is that the poor give. The poor give. They see the problem right in front of themselves. They give and they volunteer. They help one another. So often there's this sense by some that they may be a drag on our economy. These are engaged, caring community leaders who just step up.
And Jane, something to share too, that, culturally, to boast about your giving, at least for Latinos, and I would even say if you're a Christian, it's, whether it's Old Testament tithing or Jesus basically democratizing tithing to say it is the intent. So the poor woman, the widow with the 2 copper cents mattered more than the Pharisee with, the tithing, but the bad attitude. And so it's celebrated to give, and to give quietly. And the other way, when you give quietly, because your 2 cents won't compare to a big gift, but that it counts in your faith and to God, because the Bible tells it so. And it's encouraging. And I also think to because you're humble and because it's not a lot, there's maybe a little bit of embarrassment that you can't do more. There's always a feeling that you can't do more. But in the aggregate, the poor have always been the most charitable. And it's sort of what the scripture quotes. So I just want to say one of the reasons I think it goes uncounted is also because of this sort of sense of giving quietly and giving from the heart too.
Great.
How worried, I want to go back to the beginning, and a bit of a conversation about the relationship between a democracy and individual agency. To sort of give time, money, whatever one has to give, but that sense that you can make a difference. Not only should you actually can. And how important are these new forms of giving to help bring letting, when I say giving, I don't just mean money, I mean time, whatever. How these new methods, mutual aid, giving circle, GoFundMe, might be signaling to folks so that actually your gift matters. You don't have to be Bill Gates to make a difference. And I think maybe as a quick aside, say, Bill Gates has got the capacity to solve big problems and does. But the work that you all are doing is helping others build the capacity to solve within our country and the way we get things done in our country, in which civil society has a big role to play. So I'm going to call on each of you to see if you can connect the dots between these forms of civic engagement and the functioning of our democracy. Simran.
Oh yeah, it's tough to start this conversation with 6 minutes left, but I'll give it a go. You know, there are two things that I'd want to say about this. Excuse me. The first is, if you think about, or if you talk to people about the function of religion, it might be comfort, it might be solace, it might be community, and ultimately it's about transformation. And in many traditions, that transformation is about internal spiritual transformation, becoming a new best person that you can be. And it's about social transformation, and the two are interlinked. And serving and justice are a part of many traditions' worldview of what it means to be a good human. And so from that perspective, contributing to a healthy, functioning democracy to a lot of people feels like a religious practice. And the two go hand in hand. And you can't, we have a tendency in this country especially to say, well, religion is what you do in your private life, or it's, internal and it's meditative and it's about you alone and not about the community. And actually, I think that's not how most of us experience it. And so to understand that for many of us, for most people that I know and the people that I study, religion is about community and ensuring that you have healthy community, and that the transformation is not just for yourself, but it's about making life better for everyone. I think that is a more accurate way of understanding what religion means as it pertains to culture and community.
Anita.
I think when I think about the rural communities and rural regions that we work with, one of the things that's really important is, really shift this narrative around the us is them, like the cities versus the rural communities. And what we find is that what a lot of folks are looking for is that we're all one and we're all coming together to combat these problems, right? You have people that are unhoused in rural communities and rural regions, just like you have in urban communities and urban regions. And what we find is that people really want to come together across the divides, despite what this narrative is. Folks really want to be in community and be together and work to solve the problems across regions. And so that's really what drives our work, because we are a lot more similar than we are different, despite whether we live on one of the coasts or not. We all want the same. At the end of the day, what drives us is that we all want the same. We all want better for our families and for our children than what our parents wanted. We all want to do better. And so if that's the gut, how do we get there as, one community as a whole, not rural versus urban? And so that's something that we think about all the time, because that is for the betterment of our democracy as a whole.
And Dominica, a minute and a half.
And I would say, building on everybody, is the role that the individual plays in the ecosystem, right? To understand that if I have agency and I contribute in this small way, because I can't compare my giving to somebody else. But for me, this is from the right heart place and the right intention, and understanding my fellow brother or sister and their needs, because I'm putting myself in their place, right? I'm doing unto others as I want them to do to myself. then I think that then I think that's the connective tissue, right? People have to know their role. And if they know their role, then they'll step up and then they'll even do more. But if without understanding their role, overwhelm paralyzes. People do get paralyzed of what to do because these problems are so huge. They're wicked problems. And so we need each other for our survival and for the next iteration of our human race.
Thank you so much. I mean, we're so lucky. First place, I'm so lucky to call you colleagues. So I feel particularly blessed in this moment. But thank you for the work you do and for sharing your thoughts with us. And thank you to those who tuned in and sent questions over the Q&A box. The next step for the Generosity Commission is to issue a report and recommendations that we hope will not be the last word. We don't think we should be or could be the last word, but instead to stimulate conversations with folks across the country who'd like to be a partner to us in those conversations. So thank you to my colleagues and thank you to those who tuned in.